Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Literature Cross Borders student-to-student dialogue. I'm delighted to introduce you to this final dialogue in our series for year 3 of the programme. So in case you're joining us on this dialogue as your first one, welcome. Our project is all about making books for children and young people and the conversations about them travel across borders. So today we're doing that by talking about our 4th thematic pairing. So every year, India and the UK put together 4 different pairings based on a common theme, and we pick 2 books that represent that, and then we exchange them, and then we get together to talk about each of those in turn. And this year, I'm delighted to say that we're starting to roll this out to children and young people, the people whose books we're trying to talk about, so that they've been able to be part of this. So we're conducting a pilot. We'll have some research to share with you all fairly soon. And I think on that note, I should introduce our event. So I am delighted to introduce the chair for this event. We have with us Vagmita, is a third-year student at Ashoka University, majoring in English and creative writing with a minor in media studies. An avid reader, she's particularly interested in children's literature, fairy tales, and folklore. So I'm delighted to hand over to our wonderful chair, and I will be in the background for the event. But thank you all so much, and thank you to our audience for listening in.
Thank you for that, Lexi. I'll just introduce our wonderful participants, Mehak, Bakhshi, and Holly Robbins. Mehak is a final year master's student at Ashoka University with an undergraduate degree from the University of Delhi. Her research interests include children's literature, young adult literature, and ecocriticism. Holly has a background in medieval history, and before starting her MA in writing for young people at Bath Spa, she was a teacher who got to read lots of books to and with children. Holly currently lives on a boat near Bath and spends the day writing stories that feature magic and mystery. Her current YA work in progress features werewolves and witches, along with a handful of murders. So glad to have you both here. I'll just start with the questions now. So let me know what you think about the books. So both of you have read the books Impossible Creatures by Katherine Rundell and Survival Tips for Lunatics, Shandana Minhas. So before we really get into those books, could you tell me, Holly, if you've read children's books from India before?
I thought back to my childhood, and I don't think in my childhood I read anything by Indian authors, which was interesting to think about. When I was teaching, we did as part of our kind of humanities, I was teaching like 10-year-olds, year 5 in the UK, and we did about Hinduism, and with that we looked at I think it's called the Panchatantra, the like animal stories, Indian animal stories, as sort of part of the English curriculum. So we looked into that. But yeah, apart from that, I think that's it. So it's really great to have a chance to read something by an Indian author, Indian children's author.
What about you, Mehak? Have you read something by a UK author before in Kidlet?
Yeah, so English was and still is a very important thing in Indian curriculum, but my English used to be horrible. My tenses used to be all over, and my pronunciation was grating to people. So my grandmother used to make me borrow books from libraries, and she would make me sit with her for an hour each day, and we would read out loud from the books. And I think growing up, the books and the authors that were most popular in Indian libraries were Enid Blyton, the Harry Potter series, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. And I think as I've grown up, I've started enjoying books that I couldn't wrap my head around as a kid. So recently I've started really enjoying writing by Terry Pratchett and Diana Wynne Jones. But this was my first time reading something fiction by Katherine Rundell. I had read Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You're So Old and Wise. And that is a really witty piece of writing. So I was really excited to read Impossible Creatures.
So thank you for that. Now we'll just like dive into the book that we're going to read, or that you guys have already read. And I just want to know about your first impressions. Like, what did you think of the covers of the book? Did they fill you with any particular expectations? Did the books live up to it? What are your thoughts? Holly?
Well, with Impossible, I don't know if we have the same cover, so I'll hold it up just in case we have different ones, but I assume it's the same. Yeah, cool. I love the cover. I think it's really beautiful. I was expecting more dragons in the book because obviously, like the dragon features quite heavily. So I felt a little bit like I'd been tricked into well, not tricked. I really enjoyed it, but I would have liked it actually if there was like some of the more interesting characters on the front, I think. I wondered whether it's something to do with the fact that obviously How to Train Your Dragon is a very successful series here, which then obviously had the animated movie, and I think there is a live action movie like just on the verge of coming out. So I do wonder if it's playing a little bit on How to Train Your Dragon's success. Um, so yeah, but I thought it was nice. I feel like it's probably going to become an animation at some point as well. So I don't know if she's like aiming for that kind of market. And then I shall I move on to this one, or do you want to? Should we switch between or?
I'll go to Mehak first before we come to Shandana Minhas' book. So,
Yeah, great.
there was, yes, a disappointingly lack of dragons. I mean,
Yeah.
there were dragons, but really, there's never too many dragons. What about you, Mehak? What did you think about the cover?
I think more or less the same. But it does really set up the base expectation of what the book is about to be, because you have all these brilliant colors, and then you have the sea and distant islands. So it does give you the idea that it's going to be an adventure novel that will span multiple areas. And then the dragon does take up a large amount of cover, and you have both Christopher and Mal and a little griffin, which at first I thought was a little dragon. Um, so yeah, I'm not very good at differentiating between griffins and dragons before this book, but I really liked the golden casing because it also gives you little hints of all the different creatures that you might encounter. So the S of the creatures has a little manticore tail, and then the A has, I don't know if it's a griffin wing or a longma wing, but it was a little touch. So the cover did promise, it looked like a grand tale of adventure and travel, and it did promise and deliver on that front. So, yeah.
That's lovely. I think we can forgive you for not knowing the difference between a griffin and a dragon visually very much, considering you've seen neither of those two. So you're doing very well. But we go back to Holly and we'll talk about a bit about the cover of Survival Tips for Lunatics and what you thought about it.
I found it really intriguing. I definitely, it made me want to read more. I found the combination of the illustrations and the title a little bit incongruous. I think because it's like survival tips, I would have kind of imagined it to have like a more kind of like rugged cover. But I really love the illustrations and the different animals that you can see on the front, and some that I'd never heard of, like this guy. I've already forgotten the name of it, but the extinct like rhino relative. So yeah, and I thought the blurb on the back was great for this. I really enjoyed the fact that she had like the different tips, like different like little definitions of different things that you're going to find in the book. So I found it really, really intriguing. I think a child would find it really intriguing to read. Yeah.
That is lovely. Come to think of it, I don't remember that creature's name either, even though I just like brushed up on all of my creature knowledge just before this session. So, well,
I'll look it up.
Oh yeah, what do you think? Mehak, what about you? What did you think?
So even before I had seen the cover, I remember when we were supposed to go to college to pick these books up, we were given a little theme of the book, which is children embarking on ecological adventures. And we were given the names, and I refused to Google anything or see the cover of something because the name Survival Tips for Lunatics, it promised a really wacky, funky adventure book, which I thought, like Holly, would be almost like a guidebook with each chapter being a particular tip, which didn't really happen. But just from the cover, I don't know why, if it's just me, but the bear and the sparrow look really frazzled and nervous to me, just because of the way the bear's eyes are kind of looking up and there's a little outline on the sparrow. So both of them look really frazzled, while every other creature is kind of screeching or screaming or slightly smiling. So I think just because of the general chaos of the cover and this ensemble. I thought it would be a really wacky, playful book. Uh, what I really liked about even the illustrations within it is that it goes against something that was really popular when I was a child in children's illustration and animation, is that it doesn't make the animals too cutesy or too lovable or too innocent. So you see the crocodile tear away the tent or the dragon burn another animal to a crisp. So I think that was a really nice departure from what I have typically seen or read as a child.
That makes sense. Having said that, once you read like the blurb on the back where she lays out the actual tips, what did you think about those? Those fit in a little bit more with your expectations?
So actually, I didn't read that. I refused to look at the back cover for a very long time because I didn't want to spoil it in any way. And once I finished the book and I was like, huh, no tips. And then I looked back and I was like, oh, all right, okay, got it. Yeah.
That is often the best way to go into a book sometimes, though, just like going into it blind without knowing anything, without having a review. But I am still glad that both of you enjoyed the books. So just like for the second question, how accessible did you think that these fantastical worlds built by the authors were to you as readers? Because obviously, I don't think either of you would have seen a dinosaur or a dragon walking around, but I'm sure you would have connected somewhere. Holly first.
I think at the beginning of Impossible Creatures, sorry, there's a sort of explanation by his grandfather about sort of the setup of the world. So I found that was very helpful for sort of accessing it. But it is such like, everything that she's taken from has been taken from kind of European mythology. So it all felt very like reminiscent. They were all animals I'd heard of. Um, even well, not the ones that she's created, but griffins, and my school logo was a griffin when I was at school. So I knew what a griffin looked like, but I know they are quite similar to dragons. So yeah, I found it very accessible, and I suppose technically the UK is a set of islands in the North Atlantic, so it all felt very kind of close to home for me. Whereas when it came to survival tips, um, I it was still very accessible. I found it very easy to follow, but I did find myself Googling the places that she mentioned, like Hingol National Park, which is really interesting. I didn't know whether I was missing any kind of context, like geographical, whether there's sort of, I don't know, like innate things you may know about that place having grown up near it, like Pakistan, that I was missing. But yeah, I still found it very easy to access. I think the good thing about a fantasy is that it's already like you said, it's already a strange world. It's always a setting. It's already a setting that you're not expecting to fully know. So it kind of had that advantage, I guess, and that the strangeness of the setting in Pakistan was like almost kind of fantastical because I've never been there. Um, so yeah.
I think that's always a bit of a gamble, right? When you're reading like a book from a completely unfamiliar place and you don't know if like it's the characters who are like this or if you're just really, really missing out on context. But that makes sense. I think still, like even without the context, the fact that you like survival tips for lunatics makes sense. And it turns out that, we're just connecting to books. But what about Mehak? What did you think? What did you think?
I think both the worlds are quite accessible. The Guardian bestiary in the beginning really helped me, and it reminded me a lot of fantasy books that I had read while growing up. And but I agree with Holly that the figure of the grandfather is something that really eased you into this new world building. And we see this happen with multiple stories. I think when Joseph Campbell is talking about the hero's journey, he says there's a guide or a mentor who kind of eases you into the new world that the hero is going on. And I think the fact that Impossible Creatures begins as a parallel story and it constantly tugs between the world that we are not familiar with and the world that we know, it kind of helps you get used to the narrative that the author is building. And it's interesting because survival tips doesn't have a mentor figure who takes the time to explain what is going to happen or how does the world work. Instead, we have a sparrow who says, hey, do you want to be gobbled up by crocodiles or do you want to get on the move right now? But because of that, I also think that survival tips, at least for me, it raised much more questions because some parts of the plots are never explained. Like when the sparrow and the bear are arguing amongst themselves, and they say that the council has decided and bear has been out vetoed. I just kept thinking, what council? Why has he been out vetoed? So it did leave me with a little bit of questions, but perhaps these are questions that don't really matter to children, so they haven't been explored as much.
Or maybe these are questions that just really will haunt you every year from now on, making sure that you come back to the book again and again and write many, many, many fan letters to the author. Maybe. But yeah, that makes sense that both of the books go about familiarizing the reader to the context differently. Like Katherine Rundell's book has the mentor figure, while Shandana Minhas just throws you in it, but it's a sort of familiar context, sort of. So you're getting somewhat into it. Even though there's a talking sparrow and a talking bear and whatnot, you're still somewhat familiar with what's going on. Yes. So on that note, both Changev and Christopher are around the same age, around 12 and 13, and I guess neither of you are. So how do you think the books handled their entry into a more adult role with greater responsibility? And were there any similarities and differences in how the books handled this, especially from your perspective as adults who are not 12 and 13? We'll move from Holly to Mehak in most of the questions, if that works.
Sounds good. I wanted to just on the last question quickly, I wonder, it's interesting that a lot of the books that you mentioned that were from British authors or written in English were fantasy. I guess maybe it does travel better because the world is like, you don't have to know like the context of like English history or whatever to understand a fantasy book maybe. But yeah, I think it handled it. I think the responsibilities were handled really, really differently. Like that was the thing that I really noticed with these two books. Um, the like I guess their goals are very different, which maybe is part of it. So Christopher and Mal end up kind of their goal ends up being saving the world, and really, is it Cengiz? Is that right? Yeah, Cengiz and his brother are just trying to get home. Basically, that's their goal. His goal is to get his brother home intact. So he has the kind of like maybe more realistic and more relatable goal of like an average child of like I need to protect my brother and get him through this weird situation we found ourselves in. Christopher and Mal have to, like fix everything and defeat an evil guy and stop themselves being murdered. So but saying that, I found that like with survival tips, there was like a lot more violence than I'd expected. Like in that, it kind of shocked me that they were taken at gunpoint by military men and then accused of having explosives on them and being imprisoned in a shipping container. That seemed like something that was more than I think I've seen like a middle grade book. I don't think I've really seen that level of like seriousness. Like it felt very real world compared to like the fantasy world. And I think in fantasy books, you kind of, or at least middle grade fantasy books I've read, you can always kind of assume there's like a little bit of safety around the children because they're in this kind of magical world and the stuff that will happen won't be too like real. So I thought that was really interesting. I feel like it's something you wouldn't find in a middle grade book in the UK, like the kids being excused, like in prison because they might have explosives on them. So I don't know if that is like, I don't know if that was like shocking to you, a heck, or um, whether that was like a difference, like a difference in, the kind of context of it being written. Um, I
It
yeah,
was pretty shocking, I think, too. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure, okay, that to Mehak and to me as well, because I read the book and I was like, Okay, they're just okay. So this is happening. Interesting. But putting that aside, what did you think about the similarities between Changiz and Christopher? Like you've spoken a bit about differences. Did you find any similarities, or did you find them to be very, very, very different?
I Good question. Can you come back to me on that? What I think. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. We can do that.
Thank you.
Mehak, do you want to go?
Yeah, no, but I just want to say it was shocking. But even more than survival tips, I think I was a bit shocked by impossible creatures just because they kill so many people that you don't expect to be killed. Not even people, they kill a creature who is on the cover that I did not think would die, but ends up dying. So, but for the question, I like how both Rundle and Minhas, even before the narrative kind of pushes both of these kids to take on an adult role, they constantly emphasize how children are often viewed as naive or unaware of things or useless, but both the characters actively go against that from the very beginning. So, with Christopher, he has this very profound way of looking at the world. We see this in this moment that I really like, where he says that the love of an animal is no gentle thing and it often involves a certain level of blood. And we see this with Changes when he says how his parents use a code word when they're talking about the violence in Karachi. So rather than saying how it is, they say, oh, there's a lot of trouble in this area. And that just shows how children are way more observant and susceptible to things that people might think are only adult topics. And I really liked how both of these authors started with that from the very get go. A similarity that I found really fascinating with both Changiz and Christopher is that they're somewhat suspended in an in between state. And what I mean by that is they both assume a role of a sibling. Like we see this with Changiz early on, with these very hilarious descriptions of his brother as a dinosaur and the most aggressive creature on earth. But later on in the book, there's a point where Christopher mentions when he's looking at Mal after she has drunk the potion and he says maybe this is what it feels like to have a sister. And the positioning of them both as an older sibling was so interesting to me because it makes them both younger and older than what they actually are. As Holly pointed out, Changiz is too young to be facing like the end of a gun or being kidnapped and abducted from his parents. And similarly, Christopher is too young to kind of deal with this villain, the death of an equally young friend, and the end of the world. But constantly they are supposed they are have to reckon with the fact that they have someone younger than them that they need to take care of. Uh, Changiz, when he's captured, the only thing he thinks is, Timmy has never fallen asleep without me. And similarly, Christopher thinks that when Mal is throwing a tantrum and she's threatening to leave, he says, okay, I might as well just follow her so that whatever we need to face, we face together. And I think that was a really interesting position to put both the kids in, and that just shows that even when you're younger and not necessarily on this epic adventure, older siblings kind of have to balance this thing between being a sibling and a parent. And I'm so glad I'm not the older sibling. But with Changes specifically, uh, the arc is a little different. Christopher has this parent who is afraid of everything that breathes. So he's constantly trying to prove that he can take care of himself and make decisions for himself. But Changiz is a very responsible and slightly stoic child. So when his mom jokes about the volcano, he says, I don't think, what's the word? Experts would want us to climb an active volcano. And his mom says, oh, I won't tell if you won't. And he also says that he doesn't believe there's any magic in the world. So for Changiz, actually, he goes through a journey of first having to live like a child while also being forced to be an adult. But I do find it great that in a narrative like this, he goes from not believing in magic and the impossibility of things to actually being, while also handling the responsibility of being an older brother.
Those were excellent observations. Though in the middle, I was about to accuse you of being biased towards older siblings before you said that you were not an older sibling because I'm a younger sibling. So I was just like, but those were excellent observations. What about you, Holly? We have 2 questions for you now. Are you an older sibling or a younger sibling?
It's funny.
And what similarities
yeah.
do you think about the books and the characters?
I am an older sibling, and I'm definitely like the sensible one. So yeah, I thought that's. I didn't really clock the fact that sort of Christopher ends up taking that older sibling role, and it is. You're right. It is kind of like a liminal space between like being a bit of like sort of being like the mini parent, and like always having to do the right thing, while the other one's like my sister was just crazy as a kid. So, yeah, it's very very interesting. Honestly, yeah, I still struggle with similarities. When I look back at my notes, I was like, oh, these are all the ways they're different. Um, I thought that the character, like Christopher and Mal, are put into kind of a savior role, which where they're kind of like leading all of it, whereas survival tips, they're aided by animals, and it feels like a collective. It's more of a collective response to the problems in survival tips compared to like a very like I don't know, it felt very top down that Mal and Christopher have to like be the ones that kill the bad guy. And I think that's quite common in children's books, but it's a lot for a child, isn't it? Which is why I think I really preferred survival tips for Lunatics over Impossible Creatures at the end of the day. But yeah, really interesting points about the sibling dynamic. I hadn't thought about that.
Those are still really great observations. And when I read those 2 books first, I was also thinking, like, what are the similarities? Like, other than the age, obviously, it seemed like these were 2 very, very, very different people from very different places. But we will come to that later, so we won't give spoilers about that right now. We'll talk a little bit about our main theme, about environment and extinction. So, environment, the danger of extinction, and conservation play a central role in both books, with protagonists encountering various animals, dragons, and landscapes in peril. What were the similarities and differences in how the books handle this theme? We're going again from Holly, unless Holly wants to pass the bait into Mehak.
um, I can go if you like. So I love that the way that kind of survival tips seem to focus on kind of the specialness of real endangered animals, like the blind dolphins that lived up in the mountains, which I think works really well for highlighting the dangers of extinction. And then obviously having dinosaurs come in, which I think if you said the word extinction to a child, like that's one of the first like extinct animals they think of, which like does highlight the danger to the animals that we're currently kind of looking after in the world. And so yeah, I thought that worked really well. She really like evoked the magic of the animals we actually have. Oh, sorry. I'm by a train line, so if it sounds really loud suddenly. Whereas I think I although obviously it was a theme, I felt like it wasn't covered. It didn't sort of come up as much because like it relied a lot on the death of Geffen and Griffin to make the reader think about like the effect of extinction. Because it's at that point I think she says when she's sort of debating whether she should take the potion so she can become the immortal, she says, if I don't, it won't just be Gellathan, it'll be everything. I can't let any more be lost. And I actually couldn't find a huge amount of other times where she's like talking specifically about extinction. There are some like gentle references to like our world. So Christopher thinks if the Gilmarie protected the archipelago, what protected the rest of the earth? But then he doesn't really dwell on that at all. It's very much back to kind of the action of the story. So I definitely found survival tips kind of more moving in how it evoked kind of what we would lose if we lost our endangered animals. And then obviously like the heartbreaking story of Bear and his like being the last of his kind. I found that really powerful. Again, I haven't really touched on any similarities, except having that one animal that's like a touching point for like it's the last one, and if we lose it, it's gone forever. I think having that moment where Bear at the end says, it doesn't have to, what's the last line of the book? I'm only the last of my kind if you let me be. I thought that was really empowering. So I really like that. Whereas Gellivant is just gone. and I don't know if the Griffins will come back in the next book, but like, you know, that's quite a big thing to lose. Whereas Bear, you're kind of expecting the story to be that he's the last one of his kind, but the end gives that little glimmer of hope, which I think is really important in stories about the environment for children. It's something that we talk about a lot in our classes because it's just very relevant to not end up with a story that causes hopelessness in children, because like so much of the climate crisis is, you know, it can lead to like hopelessness, and children can really struggle with that. So how do you give hope whilst also being realistic about like the seriousness of the situation? So I think it does that really well with just with that one line at the end, empowering people.
I think part of it is also that they go about motivating children to care about the environment in such different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about it because I just watched a video aimed towards children about the climate crisis. And it said something like, if you don't do it for the world, do it for yourself. And that seemed really the sort of perspective that Impossible Creatures had. Although I do think that it had a little bit more also. Mehak, would you like to speak a little bit about that? Do you agree with me? Disagree? Whatever you want.
First of all, I'm really glad you went first because I was struggling to see how to pronounce Gilmarie. I was like, is it Gilmore? Is it Gilmarie? Is it Gilmarai? But I think Impossible Creatures is a book that very. Just 1 second, sorry. 1 second. Here you go. Impossible Creatures is a book that very openly talks about conservation efforts from the very beginning. And this goes back to something that Holly said about the last question, that the goal of the two books is very different. And because the goal in this book is that you go to this other world of, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Archipelago? Archipelago? Archipelago, okay, and you help save the Gilmarie. And it's this central disaster that threatens the entire narrative that needs to be resolved before the story finishes. And the life of every creature depends on it. And Rundell isn't afraid to just drive home the urgency of the situation. So she writes about the dead body of a unicorn foal washing up. We find kraken and dragons in places that they aren't meant to be found, and of course the death of Griffin. So we read about this really wondrous world that we have entered, and we see it kind of crumble right before our eyes. And of course, the main villain is this single guy who decides to monopolize the magic of the world and its resources for his own advancement. So I think with Impossible Creatures, the climate allegory is at the front and center. But I think with survival tips for lunatics, Holly is absolutely right. The goal is just to go home. And the way they go home is when the animals come and help them at each parts of their journey. Uh, the message of survival tips actually kind of reminded me of The Little Prince, if you've read it, where the little prince is from another planet and he meets this fox, and they have this conversation that amounts to saying that, nothing in the world is inherently special. You need to put time and effort and love and care to make it special. And that's what we see with the relationship between Timmy and Changiz and Beer, that at first they're like, oh, he hates us. He doesn't really like us. He's just here for the guide. But as they come to know him, they develop a real bond for him. So, although they deal with very similar themes, the way they do it is quite different. Rundle relies on this really magical, fantastical other world, and we are supposed to care for it just because of how great and wondrous it is. And she slowly relates it to our own world, saying that, if the Glimmery goes away, even your world goes away, or saying that things and animals in your world are like mythical creatures to us. While survival tips rests on the fact that you need to care for things even when it seems hopeless to care for them. So yeah, I think to that extent, I very much agree with Holly.
That is a really deep statement. And I think also the fact that the narratives of the two books being so different, like saving the world and just surviving, but the sort of function of the book being sort of similar, talking about the environment and extinction and conservation, it comes together very nicely. And since I have saddened you two a little bit with this very deep question, I will make you a little happy and ask you which one of these animal characters was your absolute favorite? Holly.
In survival tips, I loved bear. Just I know that's like a really basic answer, but I love bears in general. I'd say they're probably my favorite animal, and just like his like big, gentle, like parenty kind of like character. I wrote down a line I liked where he's I think they're going to have a new guide. Sparrow's bringing in a new guide, and he says, "Does he have sharp wits and sharper teeth? Will he look at their moon-like mugs and see the faces of the cubs he will never have?" It like broke my heart. So yeah, I really really adored Bear. And then I in Impossible Creatures, Ratkin was one of my favorites, and also Jack the lonely dragon, the tiny dragon. When I was a kid, I had like an invisible friend that was a tiny dragon. So I think he yeah, I liked him a lot.
What was the tiny dragon's name? We all want to know.
Oh, you know what? I think it was based on. I don't know if you remember the video game Spyro. It was probably Spyro. Do you ever on PlayStation? There was a game called Spyro the Dragon.
I've not played it. Maybe I should though. Though I think Timmy would fight you for saying that there's the basic answer. He would definitely fight you. He would throw hands. But what about Mehak? Which one was your favorite?
In Impossible Creatures, I really like the Sphinx. Just because when we go to the chapter of the four riddles, and after they've asked all four riddles, what's the name? Just 1 second. Nara Virala immediately says, "Actually, I hate riddles. I hate questions with just one answer," and I giggled quite a bit because at a surface level, it's a very funny dialogue, and but as you think more about it, the idea that Catherine Rundell has put here, that knowledge shouldn't have a single answer. It's deeply important in times like these. When we have political regimes all over the world kind of insisting that there is one definitive answer to everything, just the fact that there is a symbol here which has stood for knowledge and wisdom throughout civilization, saying that, you know what, it shouldn't have a single answer, and the fact that it has a single answer is really boring. So I think I really like the Sphinx for that. And I think the way Holly feels about the bear, I feel a little bit about the Sphinx. They have this very stern but gentle way of nurturing. When Christopher comes back after Mal has flown into the sun, she kind of tells him there's nothing to do but be brave and courageous right now. And from survival tips for lunatics, I think my favorite creature, I don't know if you remember them, it's Sparrow's cousin called Tinku. It has little to no role in the narrative, but when Sparrow says that her cousin was swallowed by a crocodile and Changez is jumping over the crocodile says, "We are not savages," and you hear a little word from the crocodile's belly saying "savages." Great, that's a triple word score. So the image of a little sparrow in a crocodile's belly playing Scrabble, I laughed out loud for the first time while reading this book. So yeah.
That is such a wonderful moment. Like when you mentioned Sparrow's cousin, I was like, wait, did I miss something? But that is a very, very, very good find. Um, and since I have made you two a little bit happy again, and we don't want that to last for very long, I shall make you two sad again. So, both the books deal with grief and parting, which are eventually followed by a sort of reconciliation or homecoming, making for a bittersweet ending. For example, how Change went to meet part with Bear and Christopher with Mal. How did these endings make you feel, especially given that there was so much humor and lightness in the narratives? Did you feel like you really wanted to cry, case you the author for something, or did you feel like, okay, I understand? Holly.
I thought I think I said already, I found the ending of survival tips are really like powerful. And just the handling of grief in general throughout the story, especially with like Bear's grief over the loss of his friend as a friend. And I thought some of the messages in there were really helpful. So like he gets support from the dolphins, who knew how to dilute his sadness and help him like manage his sadness. And I think that sort of just sort of seeing that kind of talked about, like how you deal with grief and how you deal with like losing someone you care about, was really, really powerful. And then obviously then you have this sort of where they're leaving Bear at the end, Timothy saying goodbye. And he tells him that all you have to do is peek inside his heart, and Bear will still be there. So I thought it was handled in like a really accessible way for the age of the reader, definitely. And like like again, episode again, Bear's like willingness to sacrifice himself, because he was the last of his kind, and he said, I found it extremely moving. With that like little spark of hope at the end, and I think there is a spark of hope in the end for Impossible Creatures too. Obviously, Geliffin's death was like heartbreaking, and I just can't cope with animals dying. It makes it's always worse than people. I don't know why in books. So yeah, that was extremely sad. I found the funeral scene very moving. I think she gave a lot of time to sort of grieve the grief of Gelifin, and then the grief of Mal's death. But she also added that the Mal, there was like she shouts at Think as she's flying into the sun, and Christopher like interprets that as joy or love. And it's not the grief is kind of then tempered by the fact that it was like a choice that Mal made. She chose to sacrifice herself like Gelifin did, in order to save the archipelago. So I thought they were very different, but both handled in a way that would be understandable for a child, considering how sort of difficult subject grief is, I think, for children and to talk to children about. Sorry, that was quite rambly, but those are my thoughts.
Not at all. I did have a follow-up for you though. Especially this is especially true for survival tips for Lunatics. But how did you feel about the grief moments, like the really sad moments sort of being punctuated with the really, really funny moments? Because I feel like we're doing a little bit similar in this session where I give you like sad questions and then happy questions. But other than that, since the authors did it much better than me, how did you feel? Did that feel jarring, or did that feel like that was woven together very smoothly?
I didn't find it jarring with the grief. I feel like humor is a good counter to grief. I did find it jarring in other points. Like I think maybe with the sort of like I said before about like sort of the violent elements, going from sort of and there's the bit where, sorry, I put loads of tabs in, but now I don't know what any of them mean. But the bit where Bear is talking about his friend or cousin, I can't remember, being taken, that's like it's quite brutal. And then I feel like that is kind of surrounded by moments of like humor. So those bits I found a little bit jarring, where it's something like quite dark that happened. But I personally didn't find that it made the grief any less powerful. I'm interested to know what Mehak thinks of it though.
To just poke on you further, and we can come back to you if you feel like you're really you've been speaking for a bit long. But what I was interested in knowing was the moment that felt jarring. What did you think that they were doing in the book? Like books, like why did you think that the author put them there? And you can take a minute to think about it if you'd like, and we'll go to Mehak. And just the same question as Holly, the previous one. Horror and humor and grief.
I think humor and grief. Impossible Creatures, it made me feel too many things in a very short time. But I think humor and wit and the amount of teenage snark that both the books have, it's very important for the message that they're trying to deliver. Because with Impossible Creatures, the message that at least I got is that how do you look at this world which is so ruthless and so brutal, where people kill each other over the smallest things, where innocent creatures die when it's no fault of their own? How do you look at this world and you say, you know what, I accept it and I'm willing to live in it and celebrate it? And I think humor really works well in kind of threading the narrative together, because it reminds children that bad things happen and bad things will happen, but that doesn't mean that it's a extreme binary, right? It doesn't mean that you can only have bad things or you can only have good things. It's kind of like that poem where they say, will there be singing in the darkness, and people say, yes, of course there will be singing in the darkness about the dark times. So it's kind of like, joy exists even when cruelty exists. And I think Catherine Rundell deals with this question that a lot of us are facing currently. Everything seems to be going to the dogs, and so many people you hear talking about, why should you bring kids up in a world like this? What is even the point of doing good things when it doesn't seem like there's any work? But Catherine Rundell says that, of course, things are bad, but you can always choose to have moments of happiness and joy and light, even amongst these things that seem like they're horrible and they have no end. And I feel like the idea of grief and reconciliation, not just with the world, but even just with yourself, is represented best by Mal in Impossible Creatures and the bear in Survival Tips for Lunatics, because Mal follows this legacy of rejection when she learns that she is the immortal. She says, I don't want to experience a loss of self or a death of self. While Beer, for quite a lot of moments in the book, he's ready to give up on his life because he says there's no point in living. But through love and through joy, they kind of come to terms with themselves and what their life means for themselves. And Mal knows it's not the end for her. And as Holly rightly pointed out, that she flies up with love and laughter and it's her choice. And in the end, she decides to say yes instead of saying no. While Beer, after having said so many times that I'm the last of my kind, he has a little hope for himself. And he says, you know what, perhaps I'm not the last of my kind. Since you and I have had a relationship, people who have been poaching me and my family for years, maybe there's hope for humanity after all. So I think humor, especially with books that are trying to deliver such weighty messages, it's extremely important because it just reminds you to laugh. Like at one point there is a discussion about the nutritional value of snot, or they're talking about how uh, Timmy is a dinosaur. So I think it really helped, and it didn't dilute the seriousness of the book, but it kind of elevated it.
Makes a lot of sense. You drew together like a thing that I hadn't really noticed before. The idea that both Bear and Mal struggle with rejection so many times, like rejection, giving up, all of that, and that is indeed very hard to cope with, especially as you pointed out, given the times that we currently live in, with stuff happening all over the world that is sad, and then you don't really understand why you're doing what you're doing. So it makes sense that humor could serve as the sort of point that sort of lifts you a little bit up, it shows you the light, even though you're in the dark times, as the poem does. Holly, I'll come back to you and I'll ask you a little bit about the question that I had said before about how jarring the moments felt and what did they do. This is just in your experience as a reader.
Yeah. I guess it's similar. Yeah, I agree with what Mehak said. It's kind of like I was saying before about kind of like the hopelessness. You can't have a book for a reader this young that is like full of hopelessness and even in real life and in the situations we're in, politically and everything at the moment. You need humor, and people always resort to humor as like not a coping mechanism necessarily, but yeah, in a way, a coping mechanism, I suppose. So yeah, I guess it means that you don't go darking. You know, there is a limit to how dark you can go with like a book for a child this age. Maybe like in an adult book on the same topic, it could be like all misery, but we can't do that. Can't do that to our children. They need to have some kind of hope, I think. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
It did. I think I maintain that hope is needed even in the most adult books,
Yeah,
even in the
true.
most like sad, realistic books, because I really don't know where we will be without that sort of hope in our lives. Certainly, I would be crying in a corner. But moving on to the next question. So as you've said that these books both take you on a journey, what did you think about the narrative arcs of these two books? What did you enjoy? What did you find similar or different about the journey of these two protagonists? Holly?
Cool. So I think we touched on it a bit before, but it's very like the actual kind of plot arc is quite different, although they're in some ways quite similar books. To me, Impossible Creatures, it felt like quite a formulaic quest story in some ways. I realized when I was looking back at my notes, I like really like laid into Impossible Creatures. But like I didn't find the revelation that Mao was immortal at all a surprise. It seemed like the kind of thing that would happen in a fantasy book. I thought that Mao and Christopher really reminded me of like Will and Lyra from his Dark Materials. I don't know if you've read the Philip Pullman books. And I felt that I sort of knew what was going to happen. I felt like, and then the ending I found kind of a little bit disappointing. I don't know about you guys, but like just because the main antagonist wasn't really connected to the rest of the story at all, and his like reasons for wanting power didn't really connect to kind of the main themes of the story. I thought that could have been expanded on somewhat. Whereas I think because the scope of survival tips was much smaller, much more sort of relatable and like real, I guess. I found that way more what's the word? I enjoyed it more, I think. The goal was very clear that Cengiz wanted to keep his brothers safe. That was always what he was thinking, even though his brother resisted every opportunity. And so I feel like it worked well. Although they were sort of somewhat just kind of running from place to place in places, but yeah, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Those make a lot of sense. And I feel really bad now, but I do want to poke you a little bit further.
Yeah, go for it.
You've mentioned how Impossible Creatures felt a little bit formulaic in its whole idea of this quest, but were there moments that you found surprising that sort of like went opposite of how these things usually go, or did it all fit like it was really following the framework very closely?
I think I was kind of hoping there'd be more of a twist somewhere, which I guess is ironically is probably is also a formulaic way to write a book. But I thought there would be some kind of like other element. I think it was surprising that Mal died, that Man sacrificed herself at the end. That was a surprise. I didn't see that coming. So I will give them that. But otherwise, I felt like it was. I still really enjoyed it. But I liked that the adult characters kind of were removed from the story, and it ended up just being Christopher and Mal at the end. But yeah, what was your experience, Mehak?
I think my experience was also like, oh shit, sorry.
No, no, go ahead.
I did not catch the last part of your question, but well,
Also yours. I'd like
Ignore
to
that.
say.
But yeah, we'll move on to Mehak. So Mehak, what do you think?
Amita, please go ahead.
Okay, apologies for interjecting. But my experience was also quite like yours, in that I really, really, really did not expect Malsef. I genuinely thought like I skipped like after I read it, I was like, she reincarnates. And surely Christopher and Mal will meet again. They never meet again in the book, which is not expected. I just thought, although because I was still sort of familiar with the idea of death of a character, I was very much hoping that she would somehow reincarnate and everything would all be very, very, very happy again. That didn't happen, but I suppose that lent a more serious note to the book. Mehak?
No, I absolutely agree with what you're saying that I had to kind of push myself to read Impossible Creatures. Like I finished Survival Tip for Lunatics in a single sitting. I think Impossible Creatures took me 2 or 3 days. I was curious to see where it goes, but with Impossible Creatures, they introduce the several creatures that they have by making the protagonist go from one island to another, and almost always some for some purpose of utility. So they go to the sphinxes for knowledge, they go to the dryads for heating up the potion, to the centaurs for the potion itself. That got a bit repetitive for me. But with survival tips for lunatics, the perhaps a difference is that the creatures come to the boys. And I think this question actually ties well with something that you had asked earlier about the environmental message of the book. Because even though the structure is a little bit different, what they both tie into is the fact that it creates an interdependence on different creatures and the protagonist. So the journey of Mal and Christopher or Timmy and Changes would unravel completely if we remove a single creature from the story. So, rather than telling children that, hey, this is the way life connects to one another and this is the cycle of of interdependence, they show them by bringing in different creatures and seeing how the interaction with different creatures kind of changes our protagonists as well. I see this change more in Changes rather than Christopher, because Christopher has this affinity to animals from the very beginning and he takes everything with an open heart. But with Changes, from this moment of being kind of standoffish or not really believing in magic, he goes to the part where he thanks the eagles and he says, "This is the first time I had talked to them," and they respond back. So it feels like uh, Changez's journey had a little bit more impact on me than Christopher and Mal's. But overall, I think they follow quite similar themes on how the protagonists go forth their travel, how do they meet up with creatures, or how the world is built.
A bit of a follow-up, though it's also a little bit of a diversion. Before you started reading out the book, what was your approach more like? Changes or Christopher?
What was my? I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I didn't word it very nicely. Um, as you said, Changes has a more realistic, a more cynical perspective on magic and ideas like that. Christopher just went into the magical world, into the fantastical world, like he was born to go into it. So when you were reading these two books, these are very unreal, fantastical worlds. Before you had actually read them, when you were starting to read them, how was how did you feel you were like? Whom did you resemble more, Changev or Christopher?
I think that's a good question. That's like a BuzzFeed quiz question. I like it. Um, I would like to think I'm like Christopher, but I think I'm probably like Changes. There are so many lizards in this house. I'm not a big fan of lizards. Um, there are a lot of chameleons outside. I screech when I see them. I don't think I have the patience of Christopher, but yeah, I like to think I'm like Christopher, but I'm probably like Changes. Yeah.
Don't we all? I think I would also like to be a little bit more like Christopher, but at least initially my approach was very much like Changev. I like animals from a distance. So it's all right as long as they don't come too close to me. But what you talked about how survival tip for lunatics follows a sort of different structure, a more exciting structure, and also how it talks about the idea of extinction of animals being endangered, being different from the ideas that sort of were written in Impossible Creatures. I thought one of the reasons could also be how the animals were written, because survival tips does have these very personified animals. And in Impossible Creatures, even though the animals are so fantastical, they are more like in the sense that, okay, that's not what I meant. They are more animal-like or just rather person-like. There's no sort of blurring of the boundaries the way it happens in Bear and Sparrow's case. Like there are centaurs, and though I don't think I would classify them as animals, they're very clearly people. And there are animals like griffins and dragons and unicorns that are very, very clearly animals. I think the sphinxes blur the boundaries a little bit, but I was a little disappointed to have two very, very clear categories for the most of the other characters. What did you think about that, Mehak?
That's a really interesting point, and I hadn't thought about it that before. I think I would still be a little hesitant in making a clear-cut boundary, because I think with the world that we are introduced in, because it's so different from the world that survival tips is set in, I think in fantastical worlds you have more space for blurring categories as we know it. So I don't think that's why it's called impossible creatures, and every time I was making my notes I wrote animal and then I scratched it over and I wrote creature, because I actually don't think the distinction is that clear. But when you're talking about how differently they are written in two books, perhaps, and I'm not sure about this, perhaps it's because whenever a species is introduced in Impossible Creatures, it's introduced as a group. So manticores, all of them have a similar personality type. They're all mean to humans, they're all aggressive. Sphinxes are judgmental, ready to kill you, but they respect wisdom. Dryads are kind of calm. Meanwhile, in survival tips for lunatics, you meet a single animal. And perhaps that's why they feel so different in their writing. We don't get that all Chiltan Mukhars are vain or interested in poetry. We get a single Chiltan Mukhar. So maybe that's why. But I'm interested to see what Holly or Vagmita you think about it.
Holly, an impromptu question for you.
If
you'd like to take that one.
I felt like in survival tips, it felt like Timothy and Chungus had gone into the animal world. It seemed like it was, the story is it's sort of humans versus animals a little bit, isn't it? Like humans are the aggressors and sort of destroying stuff and mean and unpleasant, and then animals are all, even the ones that were like threatening to the boys on their journey, turned out to be, like the velociraptors were vegetarian, and they they weren't actually threatening, which I think was really interesting. And it felt like the two boys were sort of like had sort of walked into the animal kingdom, whereas like I think you're right, Mehak, to point out that it's they were creatures, they weren't animals in Impossible Creatures, and there was that kind of like, yeah, you had some sort of some intellectual creatures and some more that were more sort of on the animal side of it. So that was quite different. It's interesting then actually that, and also I think some of the animals in the creatures, even in Impossible Creatures, were quite threatening and dangerous. So it's interesting that, yeah, Christopher was kind of the one that was like very open to all of the things that he met, and Cengiz was quite like a little bit suspicious and scared at the beginning, but actually everyone he encountered who was an animal was trying to help him in some way in the end. But yeah, it kind of felt like it felt like instead of it being like a fantasy, it was more kind of like, a fantasy world. It was more like the animal world that they'd stepped into, I thought.
Those are really interesting perspectives, especially the idea of about the difference between a creature and an animal. I hadn't thought of it that way, so I'm really glad that you brought that up. I would also really, really like if both of you could read just excerpts that you found really exciting or interesting from both of the two books. We'll go Holly and Mehak about impossible creatures first, then about survival for Lunatics after that. Does that work?
Yeah. I've read another book by Katherine Rundell called The Wolf Wilder, which I really loved. And I've always just found her style and the way she uses language really interesting and unique. Like she has a very kind of confidently strange way of wording things, I think sometimes. I really liked one of my quotes that I've written down was she was sky suited. Christopher saw that now. Her slight bones and sharp elbows had a bird quality to them. In the sky she looked free in a way she didn't on earth. I just thought like I know you know exactly what she means. That's not the words I would use to to say that. She just has a really interesting turn of phrase in all of her writing. And I have another, but I can let Mehak have a go.
If it's about just impossible creatures, I think you can go first. But if it's about survival tips, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, it was the same. We talked about it already. It was the moment when Mal flew into the sun. As they soared upwards, Christopher heard the flying girl let out a great shout. It rang against the rocks as they disappeared into the burn of the great ball of light. It might have been fear, but it sounded, as he stood watching, exactly like triumph, like joy, like love. I thought that was lovely. And yeah, as we talked about already, kind of changed it to like a hopeful, joyful message rather than one of horrible sadness. So yeah, those are my two.
Mehak, sorry to keep you waiting.
No, no, not at all. I think you're right. I really like Katherine Rundell's writing. They use phrases that I wouldn't typically put in a particular place, but when you read it, it isn't obvious, but it flows very beautifully. And I'm about to make things a little depressing because one part of the book that I came back a lot to, it's on page 175 in the chapter The Man Who Said No. And they're describing why he said no. And they say, at last he reached a point where he could no longer bear it. He looked at the world, he saw its cruelty and its sorrow, its bloodshed. He asked, is it all the archipelago and the world beyond it? Is it the angry thing of the world worth its own pain, its humanity worth the pain it inflicts upon itself? His whole body revolted, his heart told him no. He said no, no to his memories, no to knowledge, no to the terrible responsibility that comes with this knowledge. And I know that this is the point that the book essentially revolts against. And I don't know if I would call it my favorite part also, but it's one that I come back to multiple times because um, Katherine Rundell wrote in the other book, Why You Should Read Children's Literature, that the reason she writes is first for the 8-year-old herself and the adult herself. And she wants to satisfy both parts of them. And I really felt like this is one moment that did it because I'm not a child right now, and I don't think as a child I ever remember asking why things are this bad. I remember thinking there is poverty and there is sadness, but I think I was a bit shielded from the horrors of the world as compared to kids who are growing up in it today. And it is this question that I feel at least grown ups and even children now are facing much more than before, that you look at everything and as we've discussed before, it's horrible, so the urge to go against what you are meant to be and what you're destined to be and say that, you know what, no, this is my life and I will try to live it the way I want to. So even though the person is saying no, I really liked the way that Rundell's written about it, that she says that is humanity worth its own pain, because right now when you read it it's really cynical, but in hindsight, when you think that Mal says yes, and you read these lines again, you're like, is humanity worth its own pain? Yes, of course it is. Is it worth it to go through every horrible day and still come out thinking this? I celebrate this world and I love it and I live in it. And the answer to all of that, she now reclaims the question and says, yes, of course it is. And I think thinking of the ending in relation to these lines makes it seem a little bit less sad and less cynical for me, at least.
I also, when I was reading that paragraph, I thought I worried that I might not have said yes so easily. And also, of course, it was not an easy process. It was a process of loss. It was a process of grief. But when I read about the man who said no, there was a part of me that sort of understood where he was coming from. And that saddened me a little bit. So, but I do agree with Mal's overall decision. And I like how impossible creatures sort of revolts against that idea, as you said, because the man who said no and the girl who said yes, I have a clear favorite between the two. I'm not sure if you two do, but yes. Holly, a few excerpts or just one excerpt from Survival Tips from Lunatics.
That was a great choice, Mehak. You're right. It was a really good piece. I've got like a longer section, if that's all right, like a paragraph.
Yeah.
So it was. I just think it's a great combination of the humor of the story, and the kind of tug between the two brothers. So it is in chapter 12. I tried to keep Timmy warm by hugging him, but he wasn't in an affectionate mood and responded by battering me with his fists. I tried to keep Timmy warm by covering him with fallen leaves and branches, but he wasn't in a cooperative mood and kept targeting me with bicycle kicks. I tried to keep Timmy warm by telling him he has to do what I told him to do, but he said I wasn't the boss of him. I wasn't his mummy or his daddy. He wanted his mummy or his daddy and tried to rub the snot from his rapidly running nose onto my clothes. When I pointed out that I felt the same way he did, but I was still doing my best to keep going and stay focused, and he should try to do the same, he ran at me with a fistful of mud and rubbed it in my hair. And I just thought, like, it sums up that kind of, what you can hear is like Timmy's sadness, and like he's just a little boy that's lost his parents. But it's still sort of quite comical and aggressive at the same time, and the snot, which comes up a lot in there's a lot of snot in Impossible Creatures as well. I just realised there's a running theme. But I thought it captured that kind of brotherly love-hate relationship really, really well. And yeah, it was very sad as well at the same time.
Timmy was really proving himself to be the true Snotosaurus.
Yeah, yeah, it really was.
Mehak, what about your excerpt?
I think I have a similar excerpt as Impossible Creatures for similar reasons as well. This is on page 50, chapter 4, when Bear is talking, where he's going to sacrifice himself for the velociraptors. And he says, "There's nothing left for me in this world but years of loneliness and idle bottom rubbing. I will never find a mate. I will never have cubs. I will never stand at the top of a mountain and yell down to a young bear. Below that, he has the face of an empty chips packet and the brain of a flea after a lobotomy. If I must go into the great dreaming to make sure that you stay in wakefulness, I will go in peace." And I think it does something very similar to the paragraph that Holly picked. It's also humor, but with tragedy. And it's here that the bond between Bear and Changes and Timmy is starting to kind of strengthen. But I really like this for similar reasons that I like the last paragraph, because uh, he chooses to sacrifice himself here, but he also chooses to sacrifice himself later in the novel, and he says the same words. And once again, when you look at the end, uh, the idea of the movement from grief to the chaos within oneself to finally acceptance. I think that's the part that really touched me about the book. That the acceptance that things might get better comes not from a human, but rather from an animal, one who is the last of its kind. So once again, that there is hope against hope, and just the line that if I must go into the great dreaming to make sure you stay into the wakefulness, I will go in peace. I really liked that line. Yeah, and then immediately Timmy hugs the bear. So, yes, it's a little bit depressing, but I think it was really touching.
It's more than a little bit depressing. It's very sad, but like I do agree, it was very touching. What about like final thoughts on the book, if you have some? Holly or Mehak, either of you could go first.
For anyone who watches this, I highly recommend Survival Tips for Lunatics. I think Impossible Creatures will do very well, but this is not a book I'd heard of, and I think people should read it. And like we've shown, she handles kind of grief and humor and sadness, tragedy and lightness very well. But yeah, I've really enjoyed this experience. It's really nice to meet you both as well.
I've taken a note of the Wolf Riders. I shall read it. I was struggling to find another book by Katherine Rundell because, as you said, it was this one was a little bit too formulaic. But I will definitely read the Wolf Rider, and it was really great talking to you. And I agree. I think survival tips for lunatics was great, especially when they're writing about the author and they say she's threatening to write a third one, and I'm like, yes, please do. But I think both of them were great to read alongside one another. And I just wanted to thank you, Vagmita and Holly and Alexia. This has been a great experience and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It's been brilliant.
I'd really like to thank both of you as well for being awesome participants and talking about a lot of things that I hadn't really thought about when I was reading the book. And of course, thanks a lot to Alexia for hosting and for all of the help with the tech. I think if I had to end, I would probably end with this one quote by Katherine Rundell, which you will have thought of giving spoilers for Mehak. Why you should read children's books even though you are so old and wise. And I'll read a little bit of that quote. She says, when I write for two people, myself, age 12, and myself now. And the book has to satisfy two distinct but connected appetites. My 12-year-old self wanted autonomy, peril, justice, food, and above all, a kind of density of atmosphere into which I could step and be engulfed. My adult self wants all those things and also acknowledgement of fear, love, failure, of the rat that lives within the human heart. I think I'd like to end with that. Thank you for being here.
Thank you all so much for an absolutely wonderful dialogue. I can't wait to listen, and thank you to all of our audience listening in. And I will close our session today here.